have one. And hopefully he'll describe his story in a manner that you all can hear and feel inspired. Thank you, Chris, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for your summary. And thanks to all the Institute people that participated in this as well. One of the things that everybody uniformly has been impressed with actually is you. You've done a wonderful job. You've made an impression. We are new. We're just getting our feet on the ground, so we don't exactly have the building filled up yet and a variety of things like that. But I would like to welcome all of you to remain and continue to be a part of us this going forward. There's a lot of different things that we do. As I say, sometimes we look like the Department of Everything department because so many different topics get worked on. But actually what we're working on are the class of problems that you really can't study unassisted cognitively. And I'll give you examples of this as we go forward, but my favorite current example is it doesn't have anything to do with biology, but there was a testimony of a person from a lending company, one of these short-term lending companies, was testifying before Congress, and he was being sort of harangued by this congresswoman, and she, in her other life, was a professor, I think, in an economics or a law department, and what she studied was payday lending. That's what she studied from an economic and legal point of view. And so she went through this long list of criteria that they had that constituted fair warning to these people, because the argument was as well, I mean, we gave you fair warning. I mean, the fact that you get into a 200% loan is like your own problem, right? I mean, we told you. That was sort of the argument. So she gave him how you actually present what the terms of the loan are, and she said, what's the APR? And so the guy incredibly condescendingly explained to her that I guess he didn't know who she was, didn't know that she'd actually written textbooks on this topic. But she, he went through, well, it's a technical matter and it's kind of hard. But she said, okay, well, can you tell me what it is? And he said, well, in this situation, this hypothetical situation, I don't know what it is. She said, oh, I took this off of your current loan. This is yours. I just want to know if you know what the APR is. It's hard to calculate. And so she gave him a calculator. She had an aide give him a calculator, and he couldn't do it. And the point is, there are really seemingly everyday problems that you really can't do unassisted, at least not in a short period of time. And some of them have to do even with doing important things for the good of us, which I just want to point out is part of what the new, I don't think it's a new direction, but it's the explicit direction of our president. I think it's actually not a bad thing to bring up, is that we really ought to think about the value of what we're doing. And so what I'm saying is that we have incredibly important problems in front of us, much more important actually than this one, that we can't do unaided. And not to put too fine a point on it, I don't think we know what we're doing when we're producing the platforms that we use to think about them. And building machine learning widgets that are super cool. And teaching things to recognize faces and understand what you're saying and stuff. All that's really interesting, but it doesn't cut to the problem of how does this help us reason and think about the problems that we're confronting that are too important to write off and too hard to think of unassisted. We need this cognitive microscope in some cases to really get inside these systems and understand how all these pieces are producing something, and we need, I guess, a telescope as well to sort of look at the system as a whole. And it's basically that problem that I want to talk about. All the topics that you guys worked on this summer, are exactly those kinds of problems. They're problems that without this platform, you can't think about them. With the platform, supposing that you were ever endowed with the authority to do something, I challenge you to say, what exactly would you use this information for? It's not so straightforward, really. You have to be careful. And it isn't even you. I mean, the newest systems, the new system concepts are that these things are distributed among us to induce us collectively to do stuff. Even if it's just buy more shoes from that guy instead of that guy. And we don't know what we're doing, which is bad news in a way, but it's really great news for a research institute. And it's great news for you because the reason that this is happening, a major part of the reason that it's happening, is that the level of connectivity in these massively interacting systems is happening through the ICT layer. There's nothing virtual about this layer. These are very real interactions. They're as much a part of you as your peripheral nervous system is, but they extend your agency, they extend your mind, and we have to figure out how to engineer them. So they learn, they improve, presumably we're a part of them, and so it's worth considering the fact that these systems are studying themselves. And we don't know what that means either. So, there's plenty of opportunities around the world to look at things. I will point out that, and I don't say this is not, there's nothing political in what I'm saying here. Nothing. I want you to repeat that to yourself before I say it. Nothing. This is a technological statement. Huawei has a thing called the Safe Cities program. It's a customer.
So somebody, can people mute their microphones?
You might have the power there to mute them.
I don't want to touch it, so please.
Sorry.
Before it became worse for the
They got it just in time before we could see who it was.
Victory at last. So what does this have to do with what I'm? Let me just go on. All right. So the name of our institute is Biocomplexity Institute, and I'll just say that the way I see it here, and I think generally the way we are here, is an information and computational account of living systems, from adaptive molecular encoding, through social interactions among organisms. And so the example that I use, and I think I may have actually said it to you when you arrived, so if you're hearing it twice, I apologize. But if you look at antimicrobial substance and policy associated with antimicrobial substances, you see that things like laws and social norms, how we allow manufacturers to make things, how they can sell them, who buys them, why they buy them, whether it's detergents or over-the-counter antibiotics or prescription antibiotics, all this complicated mess of stuff winds up with affecting your immune system and the microbial environment that you're in. It affects livestock, it affects water supplies and soils. It puts bacteria in continuous contact with low efficacy antimicrobial assaults, and eventually they change. And they become intractable. And so you see a relationship between social systems at the level of laws, behaviors, activities, choices, and it extends down to the adaptive properties at the molecular level, at the genomic level, on the microbes themselves, and probably us as well. That scope is normally not viewed as a problem. There's lots of legit problems sort of along the way, but the whole thing, so what I'm saying is that kind of problem is a legitimate problem. And that's what we study here, that kind of problem. Large, integrative, multi-scale problems are legitimate problems, and they do have form. For example, and I'm going to go into this today, I took all this out of this talk, is that there are abstractions as dynamical networks that are extremely important in all of these. The abstractions have to be applied, but they're abstractions. You know, and so there's a big theoretical program, there's a big computational program, there's a big modeling, as well as all these vertical knowledge levels that we need to, knowledge areas that we need to change our level of capability in. And that really does form the basis for this kind of science. We couldn't have done this without the advances in computation that we have, and there's a coevolution between the mathematical and theoretical principles, the computational principles, and the products and the environments that we find ourselves in. So that's a massively interacting system, because every one of these pieces is interacting in lots of different ways. And all I'll say is that brains, networks of brains, extended brains, augmented intelligence, however, whatever we were just talking about, those are also massively interacting systems that live in this scope. So science, historically, at least since people like Newton, is in an interesting scope where they love it. We love explanation from elementary relations. But living systems resist this program. When we try to reduce life to reductionist programs associated with molecular science, I mean, we're confronted with Enrico Fermi's comment that says, well, if all these are so inevitable, where is everybody when he looks out at the world? That's why Enrico Fermi was a really smart guy. It's like little things like that. It's like, sort of leaves you speechless. Because, you know, one possible answer is we don't know what we're looking at when we're talking about life, but with respect to, you know, maybe there's other things. With respect to mental phenomena, how do kinetic, thermal, field objects spontaneously become cognate is, I mean, here we are. Like, we don't know that either. So deciding to design cognitive systems is kind of interesting. Since we don't know how a bucket of swamp water starts thinking, it's pretty important to know, because we're all just a bucket of swamp water. If you want to take the reductionist perspective. So, if it's so inevitable that we do begin thinking, and apparently it's kind of inevitable, so how do we recognize it? How do we know what we're looking at? Well, how to know what you're looking at isn't so easy. There's examples. This is just one. I mean, there's so many examples. I just picked this one because I had a slide that I made a long time ago. So there is a species. It's a African grasshopper that when they, you know, there's at the beginning of the genomic period, everybody just was, to some extent this is still going on, but it was really like sort of what was happening. Everybody just running around grinding everything up and sequencing it. And it just was crazy for years. And so anyway, they were grinding up grasshoppers and sequencing them. And they noticed that they had these two samples that were supposedly different things, and they got the same genome. So they thought they'd mixed up the samples, and so they went and sampled again. And they did it several times. They realized that they were the same genomes. And if you take this little guy and make too many of them, or if you stress them like this, when they're in the larval stage, they turn into that. Now those are very interesting creatures because they reproduce this way. And they don't have the same exoskeleton, they don't have the same leg geometries, they don't have the same mandibles, they don't have the same protein structures, and they don't have the same keratinaceous exoskeleton. But they have the same genome. And they're an adaptation, an external adaptation. So where is the information, and where's the information in this? We're not talking about exactly, we're not exactly talking about evolution. We're talking some sort of like very large riboswitch thing going on here, right? If you don't know what a riboswitch is, it's at the RNA level where you have very similar things to that. You change the environment, all of a sudden the same sequence makes a completely different functional RNA. Can you hear? So the question is, where's the intelligence in this system? Is it coded on the DNA? Is it between the DNA and the code? Is it on board? It's not a simple question. So when we interact with things, we interact simultaneously. If we're massively interacting, we interact simultaneously a lot of different ways. For example, at one level, we interact kinetically. So those are, I'll call those simple interactions. Billiard balls do that. One of the most important, the reason I bring it up is that billiard balls can't lie. If you just think about this, comes up in a minute. So bear with me. Billiard balls and other kinetic interactions cannot deceive each other. There's no such thing as a deceptive billiard ball to the billiard ball. It might be deceptive to you, but not to the billiard ball. Okay? But there's mediated interactions as well. So the interaction where I tap my knee and my leg, that's a reflexive interaction. And then there's deliberative interactions where I take information about the world, I form a state estimate, I continue to compare it against the world, and I base my actions not on the data, but on my state estimate associated with the data. So it's mediated by my state estimate. So if I'm playing poker, or if I'm flying a fighter aircraft, or if I'm buying and selling stock, there's an aspect of what I'm doing that has to do with the current price, the current configuration of things on my radar screen, or whatever the situation was. But then I have to say what it means and what those things are, and that's what feeds sort of the left-hand side of the rules that drive my behavior. That's state estimate. And in that situation, I can deceive you. In that situation, you can have the locust or the grasshopper as your mediating state, and you won't do the same thing with respect to it. So you can have, so when you have mediated interactions, what you have is several things, but one of them is that they're non-unique. Now, and there's another problem with them, and then this comes up at the end of this, and I'll bring it up now. It has to do with levels. You can always play this game. I can write an agent, like in a software, I can write a simulated agent that's an electron. And it can go up to some atom, and it can ask to have the atom tell it what its electron configuration is, and it can calculate things and judge whether or not it wants to attach to this. You can do all that. Now, that isn't what electrons do, but I can make it exactly mimic, Hund's law. So there's a simplicity criterion that attempts to be put into place. There's a guy named Morgan that made this really, really clear. You never appeal to a cognitive state when you can get away with not appealing to a cognitive state in an explanation. The problem is much harder, though, than Morgan apparently grasped when he made this injunction. Simplicity criteria work really well for billiard balls and Lagrange paths. They don't work very well for cognitive systems because cognitive systems exploit the non-uniqueness and they deceive one another. I mean mediated systems. Well, cognitive systems too, but mediated systems. And this doesn't start with humans. It doesn't start even with camouflage on frogs or something. It starts with viruses. Because viruses deceive cells that they dock on. They're constructed to perform a deception. So as soon as you have autocatalytic systems, apparently they start lying to each other. The only way that works is if you have non-unique representations for a given piece of data. And enough evidence to take the wrong one. The point is, and what it has to do with what we were talking about, is when you're building the tools like you were working on this summer and that we're that's our part of our program, is thinking about these as tools. They can be misused, and they can also be misled. They can also do great good. But if we're going to engineer them, we have to take this into consideration. And I think that one of the most important problems right now in the world has to do with the use of computational technology underlying situation assessment and decision making. It's evolving and it's important and it's worth thinking about. And it is one of these questions that it's a legit question in its large form. And it will affect you in a big, big way for the rest of your lives. So, if deception exists, non-uniqueness is being exploited, and the system must involve mediation. So one test on whether or not you have a mediated system isn't a simplicity criterion, it's whether deception occurs. If deception occurs, you for sure have a mediated system. It doesn't mean it's having great thoughts in writing Shakespeare and things, but it does mean it's mediated. So, lying is an indicator. Okay, so general cognitive process architecture. So, there's a functionalist assertion here. This is to the theorists of us. Any mashup of anything that creates this: sense, interpret, make a situation assessment, form decisions, assign actions, and take an effect. Anything that can do this is cognitive. Anything. So the question, like, what do we look for? We look for that. Another assertion is this is how it's related to the concept of agency, whether you're a corporation or a person. Things that do that, they possess agency. They can interpret, interact, and decide. They possess agency. Okay, so does such a thing have to reside in, say, a person? It doesn't have to be a person. Any particularly doesn't reside anything. Can we extend it? Well, corporations are agents, and they're composed of individuals under limited liability, constructions in the law and stuff with respect to. So apparently, no, you don't have to. It doesn't have to reside inside an agent. Well, okay, so Otto. This is a philosophical foil of Andy Clark I'm blanking on the other guy's name. Chalmers, yeah, David Chalmers. In extended mind. And so the extended mind theory basically says, so Otto has a problem, dementia, or anyway, his memory is flawed, and he wants to go to the bakery. Well, he doesn't know he wants to go to the bakery, but let's suppose he wanted to go to the bakery. The problem is to go to the bakery, you have to remember where the bakery is. You have to remember 2 minutes from now that you wanted to go to the bakery in the first place. You have to know how to get there, and so on, right? But there's something wrong with Otto's mind. So every couple seconds, every couple minutes, I should say, this thing honks, and you look at it and goes, Otto, you have a memory problem. You're going to the bakery. You're going to be on this street, continue down this street. You don't have to explain to him what a bakery is. He remembers that. He doesn't know from every couple minutes, he forgets he's going to the bakery. So the argument essentially is that if Otto could do this before he had his memory problem, and you could, in some sort of architecture like the one we just drew, write down what Otto had to do to, go to the bakery, had to remember the bakery, make a plan, decide where he was, look at his environment, figure out if he's on the route, change his route if he wasn't, go, do all that. If it was cognitive before, when you replace something with this memory thing which isn't in Otto, it's still cognitive. It's an assertion that's as simple as that. So, that would mean it doesn't have to reside inside a person. That means all the tools we're making, all the things that you're engaged with, all the things that tie you together are of this kind, if they're making you able to think about things you weren't able to think about before effectively. It means in objective terms, if they increase your ability to do it and perform it, it isn't that they're intelligent, but this thing that, this cognition is made more effective, it is more intelligent by virtue of its use. But it's also not just you anymore, and the characteristics of your detailed interactions with the world have changed because you didn't have to used to know how to use this, read, any of that stuff. You just thought about going to the bakery. Now you do. So if Otto couldn't read, or Otto hadn't learned previously how to use one of these things, then Otto's in big trouble, right? Because it changed what he had to do. So this extension is much deeper than just saying Otto's extended. It's a new system completely. And just like your neurons don't know what they're thinking, you can be a part of systems in this way, and you don't know you're a part of the system. In fact, if you look at democracy, American voting democracy, which is in the Constitution in really a lot of detail, what it does is it distributes the sovereign's mind. And it builds into the Constitution, for example, the post office. That's a technological structure for a distributed thinking system, and the post office was a communication system for it in 1776, or whenever. It's a distributed thinking system. It uses very specific methods, but that's what it is. So payday lending testimony, I already went that. Route planning. Okay, so now everybody has their GPS system, but instead of just pushing the button and accepting the route you're going to take, you accept that route, but you also post it on the cloud where everybody else's routing system can look at it. So now you can predict where everybody intends to go and when they expect to get there. So everybody reroutes. We don't do that, but we could do that. Lane changing. 2 automatic driving cars are in, there's an empty lane, they want to go. How do you decide who takes that lane is going to be something that involves both thinkers. So among people and things and teams and social networks, we're going to have networks or structures that look like that control architecture I told you about. So now you're going to say, let's take Otto's example and say, we're going to have a group of people that collect data, find out where bakeries are, find out where the best bakeries are, get maps, do all this kind of stuff. Somebody else is going to make a situation assessment and decide what the best route for Otto to take is. Somebody's going to say these are the options, and he's going to select one and he's going to go on his route. And there's all these different people and things going on. And that system is intelligent in exactly the same way also. So now you have a team, and so if I make a platform that teams that perceive, make situation assessments, plan, interact, and do things, for example, like command operations centers in the military or something, those things could be represented and understood to be cognitive as well. So we have distributed cognition is possible, decentralized cognition, like swarm-like behavior is decentralized cognition, but you can have things like a GPS system that everybody gets their position from, and so they might be centralized even though they're distributed. So if you shut down the GPS system, then you would dysregulate the distributed system anyway. So distributed and decentralized, not the same thing. We're building these things, we're making these things think, we're putting them in very, critical environments, and I normally don't see things broken out this way when I read about distributed control and distributed cognition and the use of AI in emerging world or the study of complex systems. I've already talked about riboswitches, multifunctional RNA. There's also fungi that attack things like spiders and ants, other insects. They take over their nervous system, their peripheral nervous system. They replace their peripheral nervous system. In the case of leafcutter ants, they cause the leafcutter ant to climb up onto a leaf, lock onto the leaf, and they eat the ant from the inside, and spray down fungi spores on top of the other ants. They take over the ant's behavior. They take over the ant's nervous system. They make a zombie out of the ant. The fungi, individual fungi, do not know what they're doing, but they replace the nervous system of the ant. So they use the actuators of the ant. They replace its mind with a distributed mind. I'm just pointing this out because it's important to realize what we're talking about is, first of all, already happened in some respects. It's sort of the Enrico Fermi thing is like, well, where are we doing? We are expecting cognition to exist in some sort of compact form, like inside a software object or inside you, but it exists among us, and it's legit, and that's what cognition, and we're building computers that think, and it's a really, in computational systems that think, and it's really important. Morphological computation is important. I'm just going to just say that, and I'm not going to go into an example because I'm sort of going too long. Man, I've already talked about this stuff. So engineering these systems is more than just saying I'm writing machine learning algorithms or making some adaptive componentry or doing facial recognition or something like that. It's really a lot different than that. It's extremely important to realize that these are pieces, but the cognition that is appearing is not in this algorithm or that algorithm, and whether it makes something more or less intelligent depends on a lot of things. They're important, and they will lead to the improvement of cognitive systems, but we need to be just as diligent about studying the cognitive systems from an engineering and science perspective as the widgets, because they will not just bottom up, spontaneously do this themselves. So we can wind up with very unencapsulated intelligences, ecological style systems that are cognitive. It sort of explains maybe some of Fermi's questions, as we're buried in these things and we don't even recognize what they are, but composed among us and others. Markets are examples perhaps of something that could have a computationally cognitive interpretation. And these. Okay, so bringing meaning to extended cognitive systems, meaning, what do I mean by that? Is that normally we think of you as a vertex in one of these sort of networks and all your properties associated with some mapping. Instead, what we're saying is these are all the different ways that you can interact, and what you are is essentially this line, this collection of pointers into the world. So you are inherently distributed. And you're connected to the world, and you're connected through the world to the representations of the world that you're connected to. So you're connected through the wireless communication network, and you're referenced by abstractions, maps, of the communication network that you can reference and use, and this thing just turns into this really interesting notion of a distributed self. There's no requirement that you are somehow consistent among these levels. So this is an example in philosophy and phenomenology. That was a mathematician named Rhoda pointed this out. I think it's a really interesting point. There's a concept in Husserl in phenomenology called Fundierung, and Fundierung says that you can't reduce logical items in the world to logical atoms, which is a problem for the philosophy of science, but because you have facticities and functions that can't be derived from one another. And so the examples he uses are people that are complicatedly in conflict with themselves. And so you can have somebody who's incredibly loyal to his country, his family, extremely diligent, hardworking, intelligent person, but he also happens to be, Goebbels. So there's a discontinuity between these kinds of things that are entirely possible. Where does meaning come from in the world? Sorry, I'm having problems with this. Is the meaning in the data? Okay, so rather than continue to watch this I'll let it run, but everything that you're thinking right now is coming from you. This doesn't mean anything. It's important to keep that in mind. And then I'll give you an example of what I mean by its sort of basic importance to the whole notion of what data is in the first place. If I just took one of those figures, like the little ball or triangle, I left out every single thing else and I showed it to you once. And I came back an hour from now, 2 days from now, a week from now, and a year from now, and I showed you the trajectory of the thing. What I asked you, I gave you like a choice. I could say, is it going to stay where it is, go forward, backward, left, or right? And I just asked you to do that. But you'd only seen the ball, like the little ball, say. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to calculate how often you're right. And you've seen it once. Then I get some number. Now I add all that other stuff to another subject, and I show them that. And then later, I show them the same ball and ask them the same questions. But now they have a story. And so the notion is, the hypothesis is, they would actually be better at predicting, they would be better at predicting what happened to the ball over time. Now why would that be interesting? It's interesting because you remembered more by adding data. Normally, memory viewed as a capacity. If I ask you to remember 2 things, you remember 2 things. It declines over time, but if I ask you to remember 12 things, you don't remember them very well and it goes away. If I ask you to remember 200 things, here I'm adding information and you're remembering more. And there's lots of versions of this experiment you could do, which I won't bore you with. But the point is that meaning has a quantitative effect on the data. It's related to the interpretive action of the situation assessment that underlies the mediated behavior. And you can change its value by changing how you view it. So I can quantitatively change your data environment by messing around with your mediated state. What I'm saying is your mediation of that information has quantitative impact on the information value of the data, and it is not contained in the data itself. It's contained in the mediated state. And the manipulation, there's sort of nothing new in this in a way, but the manipulation of data, and outside the manipulation of data, that's the manipulation of cognitive framing for situations, is extremely, it's the foundation of propaganda, it's the foundation of many, many kinds of deception, and it underlies all of the creation of these advanced cognitive systems to the extent that they're mediated, deliberative systems that we're making. Do they scale? Well, we're building things that are pretty big, that interact, and that I would argue are generating layer after layer of legitimately cognitive things to the extent that we just do it. This is something that was done a while ago, but it has a lot of pieces that interact, and it can go into a lot of states. And if it was used to understand somebody with it's a biological model of the gut, and if you were using it, and it's at the individual cell level sort of thing. If you were using this for a person with an autoimmune disorder or something, it could get super complicated, and you would be deceived. So we use the word intelligence, so it scales. So it's the tools we make have these properties, whether we realize it or not. They're important to consider, and we need to worry about it. Intelligence is competence. Cognition and intelligence are not the same thing. We talk about artificial intelligence. We really are talking about protocognitive things like memory, adaptation, something. We're talking about something that isn't intelligence per se, but if it was in a system, it would become more intelligent or something. But we can explicitly build cognition. And the question is whether it's performs better or not. To that extent, it's more intelligent. I would argue, not argue, I mean, I would simply assert that the tools we're making actually do make the users more intelligent. We simply are more intelligent for their use. It doesn't mean we're better, it doesn't mean anything else, but it does mean that we are more intelligent. And I think, ironically, this leads to an environment where we understand ourselves even less, potentially. The need for the research about these platforms for the study of these massively interacting systems, to understand them in terms of the platform themselves, like not studying the epidemic, but studying how we know about epidemics is important. Critical even. And that's what we need to engineer toward. We need to engineer toward competence, not widgetry. I mean, we have to build the widgets, but the system level understanding of what their competence is critically important. It's not simply predictive modeling or something. It's much different than that. Okay, so I'm going to be done in 5 minutes. This is luckily the last slide. You'll be happy about that. Well, no, there's another slide. But okay, this is almost the last slide. So, does everybody know what Russell's paradox is? Does anybody know what Russell's paradox is? Give me a sense of who knows what Russell's paradox is. Okay, good. Okay, so then I'm going to explain Russell's paradox. But I'm going to do it in a way that is not restricted to Russell alone. So there was a great optimism at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, toward the program of science in the 20th century, the reductionist program in science. There's huge optimism for very good reasons. And if you think about everything that happened in the 19th century, it's pretty amazing. Steam engines and factories and industrialization and even telegraphy and all kinds of things. Just astonishing advances. If you view medievalism and its transition through just scientific understanding, it's a pretty interesting time. So there was a lot of enthusiasm and also a lot of certainty. And so there was a program called logicism, and one of the premier voice of logicism was a mathematician, logician, philosopher named Frege. And he spent his life in pretty much disrepute in the mathematical community because logic isn't legit for mathematicians in the 19th century. Trying to ask the question, what is a number? Which is an odd question if you just view it like that. But he wrote two major sort of works. His first work was published, and then 20 years later, 25 years later, his second work was ready to be published. There's another giant in late 19th century science named David Hilbert. He gave a very famous talk on December 31st, 1899 about the program of science for the 20th century. It's everybody that studies, physics and stuff knows about Hilbert and knows about his talk and his problems. He cast it as a list of problems that would be solved in the 20th century. And the structure of this had to do with, first you would derive arithmetic from logic. And then you would get algebra from arithmetic, and you would get mathematics basically. Then you would get physics, and then you would get chemistry, biology, and you get the rhythm of this, right? And it all started with Frege. It all started with the logicism of developing arithmetic from principles of logic. And he used set theory, which is pretty primitive. You need an element operator, you need intersection, you need negation. I don't think you need anything else. Union. I think you need union. I don't remember all of a sudden. Anyway, so Russell was a preeminent scientist, like Hilbert, more of a philosopher and a mathematician, but just a preeminent scientist. And he was a great proponent of this new program, and he was a great fan of Frege when many people weren't so inclined. And Frege sent him a copy of his book, his second volume, his life's work. I can't remember the name of it. And Russell read it, very enthusiastic, wrote him back and said, Golub, this is astonishing, and so on. So I just have one question. I just can't figure this out. Could you please help me with this? Suppose A is the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does A contain itself? Frege wound up in a mental hospital. This undid his life's work. You can't do what he wanted to do, apparently. Russell was working on the Encyclopedia of the Unification of Science, Volume 1, a guy named Whitehead. Volume 1 was the only volume ever written. They never got to the chemistry and one. But it also led, to the concept of logical type. Church's thesis, Turing, Chomsky, modern computer science, everything. For some reason, we still are intrigued with reductionism, but this is a big problem. So, with respect to mediated systems, if one mediated system is reading and controlling another mediated subsystem, we've agreed they might be doing that. If R regulates systems A that do not regulate themselves, does R regulate itself? With very simple definitions, is just a version of Russell's paradox. So, that's kind of interesting, and that's what it means. As we design intelligences, they'll be typed. This typing will result in authorities, differential authorities, notions of publicity, privacy. These will become technically managed and controlled matters of design and theoretical understanding of these things as cognitive systems. We are not going to get from a basket of widgets controlled, engineered, cognitive systems. We're going to design them and create them, or recognize what we have accidentally made and correct them. The question is, how will that be done? And what does it mean to this complex relationship from biocomplexity levels, from policy to molecules? And we need to understand this, and we need to understand it, and understand that it is legitimate science. It is a legitimate program of questions, and it is upon us. It's upon you, for sure. I'm kind of old, so there's only so far this is going to get before it doesn't really matter to me anymore. But I guarantee you that it's not going to slow down for you. Thank you.
Great talk. So we'll take questions. You have plenty of time for questions. So go ahead. Yeah. Please.
So, can you give an example of a design intelligence? So you gave a number of examples, and they're generally evolved or sometimes accidentally designed systems. So what, maybe it doesn't exist yet, but what would it look like? What's an example of a design intelligence of the way you're describing?
That currently exists.
Okay.
That's what you're asking.
No. Or might exist.
Okay. Well, I can talk about one that currently exists that could get... Okay, so right now, it's not universal, but it's sort of common that if we're talking about having humans in contact with, say, AI, that we think of it as sort of like a human factors almost kind of a problem, right? It's like the interaction of humans and artificial intelligence. And there's lots of examples of that, right? But I would argue the right way to think about it is simply it's a new cognitive system. So an example of such a thing is semi-autonomous, something that I worked on 35 years ago, more than 30, never mind, really a long time ago, was fighter aircraft. That in an attempt to reduce the tempo and workload of the crew, but retain human authority over the release of a weapon, used artificial intelligence, but it just changed the whole airplane, right? I mean, it wasn't AI plus an aircrew. It was they didn't have the same tasks anymore. They didn't do the same thing anymore, but it was cognitive. I mean, it had a sensor environment. It supported situation assessment. Some of it was done on board the computer. Some of it was done, especially interpretive things, with the person. Final decision authority was reserved for the person, and many other things. So it was completely designed, but it wasn't viewed as cognitive. It was viewed as a human factors problem. And that works against you ever understanding the thing as a design system. Because you very naively start crossing wires that shouldn't be crossed and sticking things in because they're new, but they actually make the system stupider in an objective behavioral sort of way, and many other things. Automatic trading systems, high-speed trading systems, are embedded intelligent agents inside markets, which are arguably distributed systems that evaluate the relative value of things like securities. And it completely changes them. Automatic trading systems, poorly done, have created market crashes and all kinds of problems in the last few years, but we don't view them as agents that they are. We view them as problems in an algorithm, in this widget or that widget, and we don't think of it as a system that has failed. We think of it as an algorithm that somebody irresponsibly did wrong or something, right? So that's something that I would say is it's not exactly accidental, but it's important. And really important right now, I would say, our voting systems, which are part of this extended cognition that the Constitution in this country set up, are in danger, right? We know from Arrow that we don't have Kenneth Arrow, not from Cupid or something, but Kenneth Arrow. We know from Arrow that there's no such thing as a completely fair voting system, right? Or even a contradiction-free voting system. But we use voting systems as a rationation tool, a computational tool, in a distributed cognitive environment. If you manipulate how the data is interpreted or the data itself, you can manipulate the voting system. And I think it's pretty clear on all sides, all over the world right now, that there's I don't know if it's an instinctive recognition of this or what, but it's happening sort of everywhere as these systems and as people's everyday environment is more and more connected to the volume of information that comes out of this ICT layer. Right? So we're interacting in the ICT layer in a novel way. These things are exploiting that, and they're basically altering the survival value, or at least the rationale of a distributed cognitive system. You can agree with it sometimes and disagree with it sometimes, but the fact is it's changed. And it's best, I think, to understand it as a distributed platform. The last thing I'd like to say is that everything, when you have, like, if you have a command center, where in principle you could just have one, person that just has some incredible capability, and you just give them all this information and they just make decisions and everything works out. But the fact is that there's no way to do that. So you break down what that person would do into a staff, and they have roles. And they have platform that they, somebody collects data, somebody does this, somebody does that. And you change the platform, you give them tools, and together, I would argue that those things are an extension, of whatever, the commander's intent or something, right? They're cognitive. So I don't think they're unusual. I just think that they're not understood, and they're haphazard. And as the world gets more connected, the consequences of that are worse and worse, and there's no reason to let that happen. And when we have things like molecular engineering on board individuals and a variety of other things, I think we have to understand this as a rationating environment, or we can't. Or it is us. We are one of these systems that has to, study itself, and we just don't know what we're doing. I think it's a really important thing to accept and to try and remedy.
Yes, Mark.
So the message I got from the Hilbert piece and Russell's paradox was it's an interesting story, and logical types and Turing and things, and machine learning and deep learning. Now we have this cognitive systems approach to everything. Where are the paradoxes that we're going to face? And maybe they're not seeable now, but why is this better in a sense?
Better?
Well, we went reductionist, and they tried to build up from there, and it fell apart on logical grounds. And
Well,
now,
it just isn't the way it is.
okay, right.
The problem with it isn't that it doesn't work. It's just not the way it is. Okay, that just isn't the way it is. And what I'm saying is that exactly that paradox applies to this simple-seeming question of systems that regulate systems that don't regulate themselves, right? You can make something not regulate itself by an act of law, or it can just be not able to regulate itself for other reasons. For example, if you order me to not have an accent, you can tell me that, but I don't know how to regulate. It's almost impossible if you have an accent to not have an accent. Is it right? It's almost impossible, and it's a matter of not being able to regulate yourself, right? It's a regulation problem of a fairly simple kind, but it's not simple at all, but it's a very restricted example. But the point isn't whether or not it's better. The point is whether or not it is the way it is or not, right? So what this gives rise to is notions of authority. Like designing authority systems, you can't get away with saying, I'm an engineer, I don't care about how authority is distributed in this system. Or I'm a scientist, and that's not a scientific question, this is a political question or something. Yeah, it's a political question, but in these systems, it appears. It appears, and I think that you can have a technological opinion whether or not, you have a political opinion. Now, you have to have one, because you're going to design it in. You're going to have to design in, I'm not going to give examples, they take a while to warm up to give them, but there are issues of what do you mean by privacy, what do you mean by the publicity of a thing, right? And what do you mean by authority? Those things and others are inevitably essential components of design. You have to build it into the design. It's not possible not to build it into the design because that's Russell's paradox, and it's typed. There's no such thing as a level way to do this, right? It really is, that's the assertion. Not that it's better or something. Now, this assertion could be wrong, but that's the assertion.
Any other question? Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think the extended cognition that is brought by all this technological innovations has something to say about human rights and access to information, and do you think that those two will evolve together over time?
I think they inevitably do. I mean, I think it inevitably has something to do not just with human rights, but with just notions of, what autonomy is and, what agency is and how it is reflected in authority systems. So yeah, I mean, if you go to Singapore, I really like Singapore. Singapore is an amazing place. You can walk around at 1 o'clock in the morning in the middle of this very large city in Asia, completely unmolested. I was in a taxi cab that rear-ended another taxi cab. Not too bad, but I mean, definitely ran into him. The drivers got out, they got on their cell phones, and I was, listening. They turned around and looked because there was a camera. They were interacting with their cell phones and looking at the camera. A policeman never showed up. Some guy was assigned, blame. Another guy was to say the thing was filed. No policeman showed up. The new houses that are being built there, apparently, I don't know this firsthand, I know this secondhand, but I heard it from a presentation. Unless the guy was not telling the truth in the presentation, this is at least reflective of something. In the new housing that's being built in Singapore, and 90% of people in Singapore own their houses. That's a whole different story, but it's related. Because own is a different thing, maybe. If the police have to show up at your house, or the firemen or something, they're going to know who's in the house, where they are, everything. The houses are completely instrumented. And they think it makes them a lot safer. So there's a big question in that. Like, it does in a way, right? So how that gets resolved is a matter of how technology and knowledge and the ability to know and who has the right to know and authority systems and privacy and publicity interact. It's inherent to the design of the system itself. Its purposefulness, what you're regulating, who's not regulating, and so on. What an agent is, how you recognize them when they appear. All of the questions I just said appear in situations like that. And this isn't the only place in the world this is an issue. It's all over the place, obviously. And I think, so that's the point, actually. That's the point. The point is that we're, so I have cartoon-like stories I tell of this. So if my theory of you is whatever's inside your shirt, and I have this method, and I say, well, it's not exactly true, but it's really close. This is an approximation. I'm a physicist. So I have a test to find out if I'm dealing with you or not, and that's to throw darts at the thing in your shirt, right? So if I hit the thing in your shirt and you squeak, I go, yeah, okay, well, that was you. If it doesn't hit, then it's not squeaking. I go, okay, so that's my theory of you. And then I say, okay, Where's your money? Where's the process that pays your debts with your money? Where's your debts? So, is that you? Well, if I turn off the process that pays your debts with your money, we'll find out that that's part of your autonomy, right? It's part of your peripheral self. And it can be really smart. It can be, can have all kinds of features and stuff. So, we are distributed. We're getting more distributed. We actually have agentic responsibilities to these things. They have agentic responsibilities to us. It's not at all as simple as what's in your shirt is you. It just isn't true. And the systems we build are changing that in a way that we don't really have a handle on. And I think it's extremely important that we do. And I think that there's a biological perspective of it, and there's a sociological perspective of it, and there's this junction between what it is that you do that's determined externally to you and what you do that's determined in a mediated way internally to you. Because that's what's being manipulated. And so that's the answer to the question is, yes, I do think that these things co-evolve. They are co-evolving.
Great. Thanks, Chris, once again. So last part of this symposium.